accurately and impartially and in a way that really means something.
I'm Sumi Somaskanda in Washington, and this is BBC World News America. The Israel-Hamas war takes center stage at the United Nations as the U.S. Secretary of State says a humanitarian pause is needed to deliver aid to Palestinian civilians. Meanwhile, in Gaza, UN agencies say they will run out of fuel in the next 24 hours, putting their humanitarian efforts under threat. That comes as water and critical supplies are running dangerously low. And we take a closer look at one Ukrainian city on the front lines that's seen almost its entire population forced out. Welcome to World News America. I'm Sumi Somaskanda. The United Nations is warning that without any fuel being allowed into the Gaza Strip, they will run out by tomorrow and have to stop their relief efforts. Israel has refused to let any fuel in since they started a blockade following a series of attacks by Hamas back on October 7th. The Palestinian Red Crescent reports 8 more relief trucks were allowed into Gaza Tuesday, containing water, food, and medicine, but no fuel. Israel responded to the UN's concerns with a post on X showing a satellite photo of fuel trucks in the Gaza Strip saying to ask Hamas for some fuel. It comes as the UN chief warns that he is concerned about, quote, clear violations of international humanitarian law that we are witnessing in Gaza, and as U.S. President Joe Biden says aid is not coming in fast enough. The Hamas-run Ministry of Health in Gaza has put out a statement on Telegram saying that hospitals in the Gaza Strip have completely collapsed. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken addressed the UN Security Council and called for aid to be allowed into the Strip. He also warned other member states against escalating the situation.
No member of this council, no nation in this entire body could or would tolerate the slaughter of its people. While Israel has the right, indeed the obligation, to defend itself, the way it does so matters. We know Hamas does not represent the Palestinian people, and Palestinian civilians are not to blame for the carnage committed by Hamas. Palestinian civilians must be protected. That means Hamas must cease using them as human shields. It's hard to think of an act of greater cynicism. It means Israel must take all possible precautions to avoid harm to civilians.
BBC North America correspondent Neda Tawfik is covering the Security Council meeting in New York, and she joins us for more. Neda, it's very good to see you. Tell us more about what has been happening at the Security Council.
Well, it was a quite contentious debate here in the Security Council. We had a briefing by numerous UN officials, first off by the UN Secretary General. And while he is repeating calls for a ceasefire, for the release of all hostages, and really sounding the alarm about the humanitarian situation in Gaza, and as we heard there, what he sees as clear violations of international law, it was really his comments about the context of this conflict that sparked outrage from the Israeli delegation. We heard Mr. Guterres said that the attacks by Hamas didn't happen in a vacuum and that the Palestinian people had been under a suffocating occupation for 56 years. And he went into everything they had experienced during that. Well, the Israeli Foreign Minister Eli Cohen asked him what world he had been living in. The Israeli ambassador to the UN called on him to resign, and they canceled a planned meeting with the Secretary General. But Mr. Guterres went on to meet with hostage families. And as that debate in the Security Council continued, we saw just how divided member states were. There have been, Sumi, numerous attempts to get a Security Council resolution out from the Council. Well, now we know that there are competing U.S. and Russia drafts, but it's likely that both of those states will just block those efforts and that the Council will remain paralyzed.
Our correspondent Neda Tawfiq reporting on the latest from the Security Council. Thank you so much. Israel is continuing its heavy bombing of Gaza while Hamas is still holding more than 200 hostages in the Strip. The war between Israel and Hamas is having repercussions on every corner of the region, as our international editor Jeremy Bowen reports. And some of the images in his report are very distressing.
After the doctors had examined Yocheved Lifshitz, she came out of the hospital in Tel Aviv saying she went through hell in Gaza from the moment Hamas took her as a hostage.
I was laying on a motorcycle, my body on one side and my legs on the other. And the Hamas men beat me on the way. They didn't break my ribs, but hurt me very much.
Like so many Israelis, she's astounded by the failure of her country's army and intelligence to protect them.
The army wasn't prepared. We were the government's scapegoats. Hamas warned us 3 weeks ahead. They burned our fields, and the army somehow didn't take it.
Detailed planning extended to hostage-taking too.
They seemed ready for this. They had prepared for a long time and had everything the hostages needed, even shampoo and conditioner.
Running this war is getting complicated for the Israeli government. The northern border with Lebanon is heating up. Thousands of troops have been sent there and border towns evacuated in case of war with Iran's Lebanese ally, Hezbollah. Prime Minister Netanyahu has visited the troops near Gaza, but he hasn't ordered them to invade yet. So without a ground war in Gaza to define the state of this crisis, other things are, starting with the hostages. In Tel Aviv, Ehud Barak, former prime minister and army commander, saw painful choices ahead.
Is it possible for Israel to invade the Gaza Strip with ground troops if there are still hostages in the hands of Hamas?
If there is no other way, we'll have to do it, because the alternative is to provide those barbarian kind of terrorist crimes against humanity, get impunity due to the fact that they massacred, slaughtered probably 1,500 people, and a very painful and tough decision might have to be made.
On the West Bank, the other side of the Palestinian territories, Israel has settled hundreds of thousands of Jews in defiance of international law. The hardest core of Jewish settlers who've seized remote hilltops are seen by many Israelis as isolated extremists, but now their effective leaders are in the Israeli cabinet. On this hilltop near Hebron, the settlers who believe they're here by God's will are armed and say the Hamas massacres mean more mainstream Israelis will agree with them.
This is 300 years.
They said the weapons were for self-defense, but that now must change.
במלחמה יש גן ויש הדק.
In a war, you have a gun and a trigger. And for those who don't understand yet, we are at war. A war where the other side shows no mercy. And we need to be the same. There's no choice.
For Palestinians on the West Bank, these are violent days. Mohammed Saif, aged 20, was one of 2 young men killed in an Israeli army arrest operation at Jalazun refugee camp near Ramallah. 95 West Bank Palestinians have been killed by Israeli security forces since Hamas broke out of Gaza. As they waited for the funeral, it was quiet and tense.
People are talking about anger at what the Israelis have done and a sense of uncertainty and fear about what might be happening next. This is a long and intractable conflict, but
It had some certainties. It had a certain shape, status quo. That's all changed. On the way to the cemetery, the flags were from the main Palestinian faction: Fatah, Hamas, and Islamic Jihad. Significantly, we couldn't see any armed Palestinians at the funeral, perhaps because Israel has tight control of the West Bank for now. But the danger that a serious incident could ignite the West Bank is real. Jeremy Bowen, BBC News, Jerusalem.
In Gaza, the Ministry of Health says more than 5,700 people have been killed there, including at least 700 in the last 24 hours. It's becoming increasingly difficult to report from Gaza due to safety concerns and a lack of communications. But our special correspondent Fergal Keane has been speaking to people there. Some of the footage in his report is hard to watch, but those who are there want the world to see it.
What war would take away, they race to save. The young life of Yazan al-Aidi. The adult hand on the child's heart, it could not save him. This boy did survive airstrikes. Doctors at Al Nasser Hospital say killed 166 people. The little boy asks if his family is okay. Of the nearly 6,000 said by Gaza health authorities to have been killed so far, around 40% are reported to be children. Sharif al-Akras came with his wounded son. He asked if the children were the enemies. Were they the ones who'd kidnapped, the ones who had killed? There are the other wounds, what war does to the spirit of a child. Salma is 9. Israel says it's only targeting the men who brought terror to its people. Over 400 airstrikes in the last day, unleashing the power of high explosive by night and by day. This was Khan Yunis in the south of the Gaza Strip at 12:30 today, filmed by a BBC journalist. The war has displaced 1.4 million people. In the tented camp at Khan Yunis, cleanliness is part of the struggle to preserve dignity.
At night it's cold, and there aren't enough blankets. We are sleeping on dirt, the children are all sick. Where are the rights of our children? Where are our human rights?
The fun and the friendship of childhood. They grasp what they can, knowing how brutally it can be lost. Fergal Keane, BBC News, Jerusalem.
And we're joined now in studio by Hani Al-Madoun, Director of Philanthropy at UNRWA USA, that is the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestinian Refugees in the Near East. Hani, thank you so much for joining us. I should say first off that you have lost more than a dozen members of your extended family. Our condolences to you for your loss. And you have your parents and your sisters in Gaza at the moment. How are they?
Sumi, thank you for having me. It's rather, I wish we were meeting under better circumstances. The family is not doing very well. They're physically, my immediate family, are unharmed, but there is nothing is okay that's happening in Gaza right now. I worry for their safety. I worry for the safety of my friends. You know, I have a sister sheltering inside a hospital. My other sister is inside an UNRWA school in the middle area. She's the only one who managed to get to the safe zone, quote unquote. And my family remains in danger, and I worry for their safety, especially my mom, who's 71 years old, staying in the dark, trying to stay alive and keep her grandkids safe.
You mentioned your sister working in a hospital. We have heard from the Gaza Health Ministry that the hospitals are essentially collapsing. What has she told you?
Yeah, so what happened actually, the Indonesian hospital yesterday went out of power. In fact, I was in Gaza 2 months ago, and I went to that hospital when I did with a small minor injury, and I admired the health staff. Sadly, a hospital you go, they don't have electricity. You can't expect much from them. You know, without the fuel, doesn't matter how many food trucks get in. Without the fuel, hospitals don't happen. Bakeries, ambulances. How are you going to do anything, you know, in Gaza without fuel? So it is a rather chaotic scene. And, you know, hospitals are sheltering up to 3,000 people just hanging out in the reception area or any open space.
Amid this dire situation, your agency, UN agencies are saying if they don't get more fuel in, they have to cease operations by tomorrow. Given the situation, is there any prospect, has your agency been told anything about possible fuel deliveries?
Right, yeah, the UNRWA agency announced today that they would need about 160,000 liters of fuel a day to run the hospitals and the UNRWA operations for the food distribution and the bakeries. I don't think we're getting any promises. There might be private conversations that have not been made public, but we know that, for example, the Israeli side today announced that there is no fuel going to be going in Gaza. And that's unfortunate because, you know, I think of my uncle who's going through dialysis. What's he going to do? That's a death sentence for this person. And it's a tragedy. I don't know what to do without, obviously my family is surviving on pasta right now. That's what they've been eating for 2 weeks. And, you know, because they're north, aid is not getting up north. And mind you, I work for the largest humanitarian actor. I support them in Gaza. We're doing some good work, sheltering up to 600,000 people, providing services as much as we can. You've heard some of our staff, at least 35, got killed as they were doing that. So it is not an ideal situation.
Can I ask you about what Israel has said? Because it says it doesn't want fuel to be part of the supplies that have come in because Hamas will use it to continue attacking Israel. What's your response to that?
Yeah, also air. You know, I feel air, Hamas also breathe. And if we can't stop the air, then we get rid of them. That's really not a very effective answer. I get the security fears. I just want to remind everybody with a conscience that UN agencies in Gaza are credible and been trusted partner of everybody. All the parties agreed that if they supervise this, they will going to be taking care of the hospitals. Nobody wants dead children in incubators. That's not something we want to do. And the UN system, including UNRWA, can do that and deliver for the World Health Organization as well to the hospitals. So there is ways to ensure it. We know what they need. It's not infinite. We know how much fuel they consume. For example, the hospitals require about 100,000 liter a day of fuel. The other age, you know, there is measurement for everything. And sadly, every day there is fewer hospitals in Gaza than the day before because of this and capacity. Luckily, we're getting some medical supplies, not a lot, the drop in the ocean, but we gotta show gratitude that we're receiving something. Ideally, people should stop dying and stopping the airstrikes.
We just got the news, obviously, today that 8 more trucks have arrived, but as you said, it's only reaching a certain amount of the population. If you listen to what we saw from the U.S. Secretary of State at the United Nations today, he joined some European allies and also the UN chief in calling for a humanitarian pause to make sure that supplies, like you said, can get in. Are you at all confident or optimistic that that will be possible to achieve?
I hope so. I mean, I've met the secretary yesterday. We had a small briefing, but I'm encouraged. There is stuff in public and private discourse. Obviously, it's not enough. You know, Israel has commitment to the international community to protect civilians. We see that that's a problem. They have not really honored that, in my opinion, as a Palestinian with a family in Gaza. I have hope that things will get better, but right now what we're hearing is nothing good. I worry that, you know, this between the evictions, evacuations, and senseless killing in some sort, and I worry that's not going to assure us, especially with the comment that the fuel is not going to be allowed in. What's the end game here? You know, what's the end game? Are you going to take hospitals out of commission, bakeries, and then what?
I actually want to ask you about the comments you just had on the Secretary of State. You had said, I saw in a previous interview, that there is a mismatch between the positive words and support for Palestinian civilians and what you've actually seen in terms of action. Can you tell us what you mean by that?
Yeah, it doesn't seem that our life is being humanized. The first week of this war, it became horrible. A lot of Palestinians here in the home front felt threatened and intimidated in college campuses around the country and in Gaza. People are dying, real people. This is not fake Hamas studios. I have family members who got blown to pieces. The explosion was so big that the body of the dad was never found, and now he's dead. So there is a lot of challenges like that. Now the U.S. There is a quote that says the U.S. does the right thing once they've tried everything else. I hope that they will come to senses and support things like, we condemn Russia for things they do for Ukraine. Yeah. It shouldn't be any different. A civilian is a civilian. There is no civilian and civilian light. There is children. 50% of the people in Gaza are under the age of 19. They did nothing. They didn't have a choice. They didn't even make any bad decision in their life to warrant those airstrikes.
Hani, thank you so much for sharing those thoughts with us. Again, Hani Al-Madoun, Director of Philanthropy at UNRWA. Very good to speak with you today. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
All right, we're going to move on to some other news now because the war in Ukraine continues to rage on. And in Avdiivka, residents are living under constant Russian bombardment. The strategically important and fiercely contested town lies right on the front line in eastern Ukraine. Russia launched a major offensive on Avdiivka earlier this month, and fighting has intensified in recent days. For Russia, taking control of Avdiivka would allow them to push Ukraine's front line back and make it harder for Ukraine to retake the territory. BBC correspondent Jenny Hill spoke to residents there.
Moscow wants Avdiivka badly, and the people of the town are paying a terrible price. From Russia's perspective, this is a significant place, both in terms of strategy, but also symbolism too. Strategically, well, it sits very close to the city of Donetsk, which has been occupied by Russia and its proxy forces since 2014. Put simply, if Russia can seize Avdiivka, it'll make it harder for Ukraine to retake that territory. It also sits quite high geographically. The thinking goes that whoever controls that town has the advantage of height over the surrounding area. Symbolically, well, Vladimir Putin hasn't had many victories to go to the Russian people with in recent months. It's thought if he can take this, he may be able to wrap that up and present it as a bit of a success. Russia launched a major offensive on the town some weeks ago. There's always been fighting in that area, but they've really intensified their campaign. And people living in the town have told us that they are living under constant airstrikes and constant bombardment. It's extremely dangerous there. We've spoken to a couple of residents by phone. The population of this town before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine was more than 30,000. It's now just around 1,500 people. And life for them is already extremely difficult, and it's getting harder. We've been told that most of the people who are left are elderly. Some of them are infirm. There are no shops left. The last shop, we were told, was destroyed in a strike in the last few days. People are reliant on a local shelter and aid packages for food. Now, people have been getting out. We heard today from a local police unit known as the White Angels. They carry out the extremely dangerous job of evacuating people. They've told us in the last 24 hours they've taken more people out. There is more demand for their services. What's difficult is that the Russians have been targeting one of the main roads in and out of the town, shelling it. Very difficult to go about that kind of work. One woman we spoke to who's actually volunteering at the shelter I mentioned, handing out hot food and drinks to the people of the town when they can venture out of their houses to get to the shelter, told us she was actually living in the basement of the shelter now. Many people's houses have either been destroyed. We've heard a lot about windows and doors having been blown off in strikes. One woman said to us, there's no point in trying to fix those windows and doors because the next day another strike comes and they're broken all over again. And of course winter is coming. The temperature here is starting now to drop. That makes conditions there appalling, very dangerous. And with that Russian bombardment ongoing, the people of Avdiivka face very difficult months, weeks, even days ahead.
All right, we want to go back to our top story now, the Israel-Hamas war, because we can speak to our international editor, Jeremy Bowen, who is in southern Israel tonight with the latest on the story. Jeremy, it's good to see you. Tell us what you have witnessed, what you have heard today on the ground.
Well, I'm actually in Jerusalem, and I've been in the West Bank, Israeli occupied today, and I have seen, I'll tell you what, my impression, because people there are, Israelis and Palestinians are really very different in many respects. And I've seen hardline Jewish settlers and Palestinians at a funeral. What they share, rather than the many things that divide them, is, I think, a real feeling that the old status quo has gone. They don't know what's coming next, but they're very nervous about it.
Jeremy, we've heard that there is pressure in the meantime growing on Israel to have more aid allowed into Gaza. What are some of the responses been there in Jerusalem to that?
Well, Israel, has been resisting pressure to bring the amount of aid that the UN want in. What's happened is essentially that President Joe Biden and Israel's Prime Minister Netanyahu together agreed that there would be a flow of aid in. But right now, up to now, I think you can only describe it as a token flow. It's not enough to make a difference. It's not enough to shift the dial. The UN estimates that the bare minimum that they would need, if fuel was included on the trucks to pump water, is 100 trucks a day. They've been getting a fraction of that. And they haven't been able to bring in fuel. So they're not at all happy with that, which is a strong reason why Mr. Guterres, the Secretary General, has been voicing his concern.
Our international editor, Jeremy Bowen in Jerusalem. Thank you so much, Jeremy. And that's our show. Thank you for watching World News America. Stay with us.
Hello there. Let's take a look at the latest weather forecasts across